Hollywood has always thrived on glamour mystery and the carefully constructed images of its brightest stars. But every once in a while, something emerges that rips the curtain wide open and forces the world to see the shadows hiding behind the spotlight. And that is exactly what has happened with the shocking new evidence connected to Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively. What was once whispered about in private circles has now exploded into a public storm, and the revelations are unlike anything the industry has seen in years. This is not just about a disagreement or a creative clash. This is about control power and the shocking moment when Baldoni and his team realized they were not partners in collaboration, but pawns in a larger strategy. The word hostage is being used not in the literal sense, but in the emotional, professional, and psychological sense, where freedom of choice was stripped away piece by piece until there was no room left to move. The evidence paints a chilling picture of how charm pressure and persuasion created an invisible cage around them. And once that cage was exposed, everything changed forever. And Hollywood has not stopped talking about it since. Justin Baldoni new evidence shows shocking moment they realized. Blake held them hostage. This is the headline that is shaking Hollywood to its very core. And in this first part, we are going to dive into the context, the setup, and the exact circumstances that are now making people question everything they thought. They knew about this escalating battle. When you look at Hollywood dramas, they are usually filled with rumors, speculation, and whispers. But what makes this situation so explosive is that documented material has surfaced things that insiders claim were never meant to see the light of day. And these details paint a portrait of control manipulation and power plays that could change the trajectory of careers, reputations, and legacies. The introduction of this evidence did not just catch fans off guard, it left even industry veterans stunned because the implications are much larger than a simple disagreement between colleagues. It speaks to the unspoken rules of Hollywood. It speaks to the way power dynamics have been used for decades. And it reveals how certain relationships are not as genuine as they appeared to be on the surface. In the intro hook, we have to capture the audience attention fully. And the first thing to understand is that this new evidence is not just paperwork. It is not just speculation. It is the kind of material that forces people to rethink everything. Imagine believing you are working in a creative partnership, only to realize that behind the scenes, there were attempts to isolate control and pressure people into compliance. And when Justin Baldoni legal team finally pieced this together, it was like a light bulb moment. A shocking realization that what was unfolding was not normal disagreements. It was an attempt to maintain a kind of power dynamic that blurred personal and professional lines. The evidence points to one thing very clearly. There was a moment in this saga where it was undeniable to those inside that they were being cornered, trapped into a situation where compliance was not optional but demanded. And this is why the word hostage is being used. Not in the literal sense, but in the sense of emotional and professional entrapment. It is a bombshell that is already dominating conversations, and what we are about to break down is the timeline, the buildup, and the discovery that changed everything. Because once the evidence came out, there was no going back. This is the intro, and now we move into the deep breakdown. So how did it all begin? Justin Baldoni has long been seen as an actor, director, and producer who values authenticity. He built his reputation not just on his roles, but on his commitment to creating work that reflects depth, compassion, and humanity. His projects, whether on screen or behind the camera, have carried a distinct mark of sincerity, but the path of sincerity in Hollywood often collides with the machinery of those who operate differently, and that is where the tension with Blake Lively began. On the outside, it looked like a friendly and even collaborative dynamic. But under the surface, there were currents pulling in opposite directions. Baldoni Circle has described how the initial stages of their interactions seemed fine. There were conversations about creative ideas, collaborations, and opportunities, but very quickly things shifted. Subtle patterns started to appear, requests that seemed harmless but carried hidden pressure and expectations. And as months went on, those small pressures became larger constraints. It reached a point where Justin and his team felt that decisions were no longer collaborative. They were dictated. And the chilling part was that they did not fully realize it until the evidence forced them to see what was happening. The evidence itself comes in multiple forms. According to reports, there are exchanges, documents, and timelines that illustrate how moments of choice were systematically removed from the equation. What seemed like friendly persuasion in reality was a narrowing of options. until one direction was left available, and that direction was always aligned with Blake's perspective. Insiders described the atmosphere as suffocating, not because of overt threats, but because of the way expectations were framed. The moment of realization came when they put all the pieces together and saw that every step had been guided, pushed, and nudged until there was no room to maneuver anymore. This was not partnership, this was control. And that is why Baldoni legal team used the word hostage Hollywood. Insiders are now buzzing about the specifics of what that control looked like. One key moment reportedly came during negotiations over a joint project that was supposed to be built on shared vision. The conversations started as open brainstorming, but gradually it became clear that suggestions from Justin's team were being sidelined, and instead alternative directions were introduced with language that made them sound like compromises, when in reality, they were non-negotiable demands by the time. The team realized what had happened. They were locked into commitments that they had not truly agreed upon, and this was the spark that set off alarm bells. As this unfolded, another layer to the story emerged, which is the reaction of people. Around them, those who had worked in similar dynamics before immediately recognized the signs. They described how control in Hollywood is rarely exercised through overt aggression. More often, it is wrapped in charm, flattery, and the illusion of choice. But the end result is the same. The controlled party finds themselves boxed in, unable to move without consequences. And this is exactly what Justin Baldoni's circle felt they had stumbled into when the evidence became clear. But what makes this revelation so significant is not just the internal battle. It is how it resonates across the industry, because many are now looking at this case as a mirror reflecting the darker sides of Hollywood relationships, where the image projected to the public is one of camaraderie and friendship. But the behind-the-scenes reality is a series of pressures, tactics, and maneuvers meant to protect power and image. When the evidence broke, it was not just about Baldoni and Lively. It was about how many others have been caught in similar webs of control but never had the courage or opportunity to call it out. And here is where the public reaction begins to matter, because as this story unfolded, fans of both stars were thrown into confusion for years. People had associated Blake Lively with a polished public image, admired by many and rarely caught in controversies, while Baldoni was seen as a figure of quiet integrity. The collision of those reputations with this evidence creates shockwaves because it challenges the very narratives that fans had embraced. The internet is filled with debates, arguments, and speculation as people try to reconcile the public images with the private realities. And the more that comes out, the more divided those reactions become. What cannot be denied, however, is that the legal side of this battle has teeth. Justin Baldoni legal team has not only brought forward the evidence but also framed it in a way that makes it impossible to dismiss. The hostage metaphor is not being used lightly. It is being used to convey the exact sense of entrapment they felt during critical moments. And that framing has already begun to influence the way media outlets cover the story. Headlines now use words like shocking, controlling, and explosive to describe the evidence. And it is that framing that keeps the story alive in the public eye. For Baldoni, this is more than a legal battle. It is a battle for narrative, because in Hollywood, reputation can be as valuable as any contract. And what his team seems determined to do is to ensure that the narrative reflects the truth as they see it. The hostage moment is not just a dramatic phrase, it is the symbol of the entire struggle. A symbol that communicates to anyone watching that they were pushed into a corner until the evidence allowed them to finally see the walls around them. And so part one ends with this picture painted clearly. Justin Baldoni and his team believed they were in collaboration, but the evidence showed them that they were in control dynamics disguised as cooperation. The realization that they were not partners but participants in a structure designed to benefit one side at the cost of the other was the shocking moment that now defines the case. Moving forward, the shockwaves from the release of this new evidence did not stop at the moment of discovery. In fact, the realization that Justin Baldoni and his team had been maneuvered into a corner was only the beginning, because once the documents and exchanges were pieced together, the scope of what had been happening expanded dramatically. What at first looked like isolated incidents quickly revealed itself to be a consistent pattern that stretched across months and possibly years. And that is when the magnitude of the situation hit everyone involved like a tidal wave. The more they examined the material, the more it became clear that this was not a coincidence or a misunderstanding. It was strategy, it was design, and it was methodical. Insiders who have now reviewed some of these materials, describe it as a roadmap, where every turn, every detour, and every destination was already set out before the journey began. For Baldoni and his supporters, the painful part of this revelation was realizing that they had been walking down this road thinking it was their own choices guiding them, when in reality the path had been laid brick by brick to funnel them into predetermined outcomes. The second layer of shock came when they realized how subtle the tactics had been. There were no obvious ultimatums, there were no blunt threats. Instead, everything was wrapped in language of friendship, cooperation, and opportunity. Every time a suggestion was made, it was presented as if it were in their best interest. Every time an objection was raised, it was met with carefully crafted reassurances that gave the illusion of compromise. But in hindsight, those compromises were nothing more than concessions designed to move them further into alignment with a singular vision. What made this even more chilling was the realization that by the time they recognized the pattern, they were already too far in to back out without consequences. Every agreement, every signature, every conversation had nudged them closer to the point where their freedom of choice was reduced to a formality. Hollywood observers are now pointing out that this kind of control tactic is not new. What makes this case so significant is that for once there is evidence tangible, proof that can be analyzed, scrutinized, and discussed in public forums. Many industry veterans who have operated in silence for decades are privately admitting that they recognize the signs because they too have been caught in similar traps, but without the courage or leverage to fight back. In that sense, Baldoni battle is not just his own. It is being seen as symbolic, a stand against a culture of manipulation that thrives in the shadows. One prominent commentator even described it as pulling back the curtain on The Wizard of Oz, because for years the machinery of power has operated behind polished images and public smiles. But now the machinery is exposed for what it truly is. The media has latched onto one specific episode that seems to crystallize this entire narrative. According to insiders, there was a meeting that should have been routine, a gathering meant to finalize details of a creative project. At first, the tone of the meeting was light, conversational, even supportive. But as the hours passed, subtle shifts began to appear. Justin Team would raise points that were quickly glossed over, while alternative suggestions were introduced with such confidence and charm that they almost seemed irrefutable. Witnesses described it as a masterclass in persuasion, where every objection was transformed into agreement, without anyone realizing how it happened until afterward, when they reviewed their notes and realized that nothing they had wanted to preserve had actually survived the process. It was in that moment of reflection that the feeling of being held hostage solidified, because they saw in black and white how their voices had been erased. And this is where the evidence takes on its most powerful role, because without the documents, without the transcripts, and without the timelines, it might still have been possible to dismiss their feelings as paranoia or exaggeration. But with the evidence, the patterns are undeniable. With each email, each exchange, and each memo, the picture becomes clearer and clearer. It is the kind of clarity that does not just sway legal battles, it sways public opinion too. And once the public begins to see the story not as speculation, but as evidence-based truth, the conversation changes entirely. Social media has exploded in response to these revelations. Hashtags are trending, debates are raging, and fans are polarized. Some continue to defend Blake, pointing to her years of cultivating a positive image and questioning whether these revelations could really be true. Others, however, argue that the evidence is too specific, too detailed, and too consistent to be fabricated. And they see in Justin Baldoni's willingness to push this into the public sphere a kind of courage that is rare in Hollywood, especially when going up against someone with such an established brand. The polarization is intense, but the conversation itself is a sign of how deeply the revelations have resonated, because Hollywood thrives on image management. And once that image is disrupted, the ripples are uncontrollable. Beyond the world of fans and social media, there is the professional sphere, where the fallout could be even more devastating. Already, there are reports that agents, managers, and even fellow actors are quietly reassessing their alliances, because if this kind of evidence can surface once, it could happen again. And no one in Hollywood wants to be caught on the wrong side of a narrative shift. The hostage metaphor is powerful because it translates across boundaries. It is not just a legal phrase, it is an emotional image that everyone understands. And once that image is associated with a name or a face, it is incredibly difficult to shake. Legal analysts who have followed this case closely are emphasizing that the strategy behind Baldoni legal team was to frame the evidence in terms that resonate with both the court and the public. They did not present it as a dry list of violations. They presented it as a story, a narrative, with characters, moments, and realizations. And that narrative is what gives the evidence its power in an industry where storytelling is everything. This approach is proving effective because it allows people to not only understand the situation intellectually, but also to feel it emotionally. What is unfolding now is a battle not just in courtrooms, but in the court of public opinion. And both sides understand the stakes very clearly. For Justin Baldoni, the goal is to establish himself as someone who recognized manipulation, fought against it, and refused to be silenced. For Blake Lively, the challenge is to preserve an image that has taken years to build, an image of elegance, positivity, and relatability that now risks being overshadowed by words like control, manipulation, and hostage. The clash between these two narratives is what makes this case not only fascinating, but historic, because it is playing out in real time in front of an audience of millions as we look toward the next stages of this saga. It becomes clear that the hostage moment is not just a single episode, but a symbol. It is the shorthand for an entire pattern of behavior that is now under scrutiny. And as more evidence continues to emerge, the likelihood that this narrative will fade seems smaller and smaller. The more people see, the clearer the picture becomes. And once a picture is clear, it cannot be unseen. For Baldoni and his supporters, that is both the burden and the strength of their position. The burden because it forces them to relive and retell painful realizations, the strength because the truth once revealed cannot be pushed back into the shadows. So part 2 closes with this broader understanding. The hostage moment was not just a shocking realization in a single instant. It was the culmination of months of subtle tactics, pressures, and manipulations that only became undeniable when the evidence was compiled and examined. It is this evidence that has given Baldoni and his team the foundation to not only defend themselves, but to challenge an entire culture of silence and control in Hollywood. The deeper this case goes, the more it becomes clear that the hostage moment was not an isolated event, but rather the centerpiece of a larger narrative that exposes how influence and control have been exercised quietly within Hollywood for years. What makes this revelation so devastating is not just the impact on Justin Baldoni and his team, but the ripple effect it is creating across an industry that thrives on image, reputation, and carefully curated partnerships. Insiders are now beginning to connect dots from earlier stages of the professional relationship between Baldoni and Lively, suggesting that the warning signs had been present long before anyone realized their significance. There were instances of projects suddenly being shifted in direction without consensus, moments where commitments were assumed rather than agreed upon, and even occasions when outside voices were subtly excluded from conversations under the pretense of efficiency. These seemingly small moves added up over time, and once viewed through the lens of the newly surfaced evidence, they no longer look like coincidences. They look like steps in a carefully managed plan. The revelation of these patterns has made legal experts draw comparisons to psychological strategies often seen in high-pressure negotiations, where one side uses charm, subtle pressure, and the illusion of choice to slowly reduce the freedom of the other side until compliance feels like the only option in this context. The term hostage is resonating more powerfully than ever because it captures the sense of losing agency while still being physically free. It is the emotional and professional equivalent of being trapped in a room with invisible walls, and for Baldoni, that realization was not only shocking but deeply personal because it challenged his belief in trust, authenticity, and collaboration values he had built his career upon. What amplifies the gravity of this situation is how it intersects with the public perception of both figures. For years, Blake Lively has been embraced as a symbol of Hollywood elegance, balancing career with family, projecting an image of relatability and control. In equal measure, this image has been crafted with care and defended with persistence. So when evidence emerges that suggests behind the curtain there were calculated strategies of control, the contrast is almost too stark to process. Fans who once admired her for her charm and poise are now forced to wrestle with allegations that depict a different reality, and that dissonance is fueling intense debate across social media platforms, forums, and media outlets, with discussions often spiraling into heated arguments as supporters and critics clash. Over who to believe. For Baldoni, the challenge is equally layered, because while he is now being portrayed as the victim of manipulation, he also faces the risk of being seen as naive or overly trusting. His brand has always centered on sincerity and compassion, but in the ruthless world of Hollywood, such qualities are often seen as weaknesses. The fact that he did not immediately recognize the tactics being used against him could be used against him in the public sphere. Yet his legal team has been careful to frame the narrative not as one of weakness, but of awakening. The emphasis is on how even someone with integrity and good intentions can be ensnared in a web of control, and how the act of exposing that web is itself an act of courage. This framing has begun to gain traction, especially among commentators who view the case as a metaphor for larger societal issues of power and coercion. One of the most startling aspects of the new evidence is how it reveals not just the pressure applied to Baldoni, but also the isolation that was quietly enforced. Insiders have described how individuals who might have supported him were gradually pushed to the margins through subtle dismissals, exclusion from meetings or narratives that painted them as obstacles rather than allies over time. This created an environment where Baldoni and his core team felt increasingly alone. Their concerns dismissed, their instincts questioned, and their confidence slowly eroded until the evidence finally brought clarity to what had been happening. This strategy of isolation is a classic method of control because it prevents dissenting voices from interrupting the narrative and ensures that the target begins to doubt their own judgment. A psychological toll of this cannot be overstated. Sources close to Baldoni describe the period leading up to the revelation as emotionally draining, filled with confusion, second-guessing and mounting frustration at why things never seemed to align. The way they were promised when the evidence surfaced and the pattern was undeniable. There was a mixture of relief and devastation. Relief because the feelings of being manipulated were finally validated, devastation because it meant the trust that had been extended was not only misplaced, but exploited. And in Hollywood, where trust is already scarce, the shattering of such trust can be career-altering. Media coverage has amplified these dynamics by focusing on the most dramatic elements of the evidence, with headlines emphasizing the word hostage and repeatedly referencing the shocking realization that shifted the course of events. Commentators are dissecting emails, messages, and timelines, drawing attention to the language used and how it reveals subtle coercion techniques. Phrases that once seemed supportive are now being reinterpreted as coded maneuvers to enforce compliance. And this forensic level of analysis is ensuring that the story continues to dominate cycles, because every detail adds fuel to the fire. What makes this even more powerful is how other Hollywood figures are beginning to weigh in. Not necessarily by taking sides, but by acknowledging that the dynamics described are all too familiar. Some have spoken anonymously about similar experiences where collaboration slowly turned into control, where freedom of choice was eroded until they too felt trapped. While not all are willing to publicly attach their names to these stories, the very fact that the conversation is expanding is a testament to how strongly the Baldoni case has struck a chord. The hostage metaphor has become shorthand for an entire set of experiences that many had buried in silence. Legal experts are also stressing that this case is unique because it combines emotional resonance with tangible evidence. Usually, allegations of manipulation in Hollywood remain in the realm of he said, she said. But here there is a trail, a documented history that allows the public and the courts to see not just the outcomes, but the process leading to them. And that is what makes the hostage narrative so potent. It is not abstract, it is grounded in specifics that can be analyzed and debated. The fallout professionally is already evident. Reports suggest that ongoing negotiations involving Blake Lively have slowed down as studios and partners wait to see how this case develops, while Justin Baldoni is receiving a surge of support from colleagues who admire his willingness to confront the situation even at great personal and professional risk. This reversal of fortunes is remarkable, because only months ago the assumption was that Lively's position was untouchable, while Baldoni was viewed as a quieter figure in the industry. Now the narrative is shifting rapidly, and the power balance is no longer certain. Public reaction continues to drive the intensity of the case, with online communities dissecting every new leak, every court filing, and every statement. Reactions range from disbelief to outrage to admiration, and the sheer volume of discussion is ensuring that the story remains at the center of Hollywood discourse for Baldoni. This means both pressure and opportunity pressure, because every move is under scrutiny opportunity, because the more people understand the evidence, the stronger his position becomes. And so part 3 leaves us with a picture of deepening complexity. The hostage moment is now understood not just as an event, but as a symbol of a broader strategy, one that relied on charm, isolation, persuasion, and subtle coercion to trap Baldoni and his team in a narrative they did not choose. The exposure of this strategy has shaken the foundations of Hollywood reputation management and forced an uncomfortable conversation about the hidden mechanics of power. The journey is far from over, but what has been revealed so far ensures that the case will continue to dominate attention as it unfolds, as this saga continues to unfold. One truth is becoming undeniable. The revelations surrounding Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively have transformed from whispers into a storm that refuses to fade. The evidence that surfaced was not just paperwork or private conversations. It was a mirror reflecting the hidden mechanisms of control that exist in Hollywood, and the hostage moment became the symbol of an entire struggle for agency and truth. What began as a shocking realization for Baldoni and his team has now grown into a narrative that the entire industry is watching with fascination and unease. The debates, the reactions, and the fallout prove that this story is about much more than two individuals. It is about how power operates in silence, and how those who dare to challenge it risk everything. Yet in that risk lies strength. Baldoni's decision to confront this dynamic publicly has reshaped how he is perceived, shifting him from victim to fighter and creating a ripple effect across the entertainment world. Whether this battle ends in legal victory or not, its impact is already historic because it has opened a conversation that can no longer be ignored, and Hollywood will never look the same again.